Okay, I feel Vivek is having some internet connections, so I'll just simply give the disclaimer to everyone about the session. So this session is about the 30 years of economic reforms since 1991. And this will be bilingual. If you have any questions, you can ask them in Hindi or in English. We can, if sir is comfortable only in English, we can translate those questions to English for him. Please maintain the decorum of the meeting. Any kind of mischief will lead to the immediate removal. And the final of this session will be recorded. We'll be uploading it on our YouTube channel later. So if in case you will have to leave early or your friends wanted to join it, but they couldn't, so you can share the link with them always. Krishika and Amna, over to you.
Thank you, Mehak. Okay. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. A very pleasant morning to all of you. Today I, Krishika Jaishwal, the Executive Council member of Kartavya, the Civil Services Society of Kirodimal College, University of Delhi, with my co-host for the day, Amna Khan, an Executive Council member, welcome you all to this first event of the series of our annual fest, Junoon. Founded in 2017, Kartavya endeavors to provide a collaborative learning ambience to all the learners, which are emblematic of our principles as pretty corps. Junoon, our annual fest, is a reflection of enthusiasm and culmination of the hard work of every member of Kartavya. As a part of a Junoon, we will be having a plethora of brainstorming intellectual sessions and experiencing the bliss of learning and synergy with our contemporaries. Carry the session forward. I would like to invite my co-host Amna Khan to briefly introduce our guest. Thank you.
धन्यवाद कृषिका, आप सभी को मेरी ओर से एक जुनून भरा सुप्रभात. I am Amna Khan and I'm feeling extremely privileged and honored to welcome our guest speaker and economist Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I welcome you, sir, on behalf of Kartavya, and we all are indebted to you for taking out your time and joining us for this interactive session on 30 years of economic reforms, achievement, and limitations. Sir is an Indian economist and a civil servant who was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Sir ने अपनी ग्रेजुएशन की डिग्री सेंट स्टीफेंस कॉलेज दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय से और आगे जाकर फिलॉसफी, पॉलिटिक्स और इकोनॉमिक्स में पोस्ट ग्रेजुएशन की डिग्री यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ऑक्सफोर्ड से प्राप्त की. He has received several honorary degrees, including an honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford and an honorary degree of Doctor of Philosophy from the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. He is here with us today to broaden our knowledge on 30 years of economic reform. The new economic reforms refer to the new liberal policies that the Indian government introduced in 1991. The three main pillars of this reform were liberalization, globalization, and privatization. अब मैं सर से आग्रह करूंगी कि वे इस सेशन को आगे बढ़ाएं. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amla ji. I think this is my first bilingual introduction, and I must compliment you for doing it so smoothly. I'm very pleased to be invited by Kirodimal College. You know, I used to visit your college when I was a student in the 1960s and engage in debates, and I remember all that very nicely. So it's good to be talking to you all virtually. Now, it has been explained to me that you all want to know about the 91 reforms. I mean, were they the right thing? Were they the wrong thing? There are different views, and that's good because, you know, in all policy matters, there should be different views. And actually, there is no one view that is absolutely right. Now, my concern is I've been told I must speak for 25 minutes and then leave it open to questions. And I see you've got almost 100 people participating. So frankly, I would like to hear the questions because the generation that is listening wasn't born when the 91 reforms happened. And I'm sure that you don't want me to get lost in those periods. So what I will do is, first in modern life, everything is dominated by advertisement. Let me do an advertisement for my book by holding it up. Now, everything I had to say about how the reforms happened, the background, and all the rest of it is in this book, Backstage. I hope it's in your library, and who knows, some of you may even want to go and buy it. Uh, anyway, borrow it from the library, read in detail. So I won't try to summarize all of that in 25 pages. Let me therefore just go straight to the what you might call the big points, mota points that I want to make. And I think I know your concern is really about policy and India's future. I mean, in a way, you are India's future, so you should be interested in the future much more than people of my age. See, the main thing to remember is that one argument is, why is 91 so important? Because reform things always happen every year. I mean, every government uh, uh, presents a budget every year, and if you ask that government, whichever it is, that would you say that this budget is nothing more than a continuation of what you've been doing, they will say, no, 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 it has very dynamic new directions. And I've been hearing this for the last 30 years. So I'm not criticizing any one finance minister, but there are occasions where you make a big break from the past. And I think 1991, just as post-independence, the new economic policy that India outlined was a big break from the past. 1991 was a big break. In between, there were all kinds of progresses. And after 91 also, it's not as if 1991 stopped reforms and then we saw the reforms unfolding. There have been continuing changes. Even the fellows who introduced the reforms said they're going to do it gradually, and in some cases they were backing off incomplete action, and more recently even some reversal. So I want to give you a sense of what happened. See, first thing is that, and those of you who are relating these reforms to today must know that when the reforms were introduced, there was a much greater global consensus on what constitutes sensible policy. Remember, in 1991, essentially, the Soviet Union was going to self-destruct at the end of that year. The East European countries had already broken away. The world was very much in a environment where the perception was that integrating with the whole the global economy is good, and many countries in East Asia had done much better than India. No, so we were very aware that, look here, whatever we may be talking about ourselves, and we are always talking about ourselves, the fact is that countries like, and I'm not just talking now about China, countries like Korea, countries like Malaysia, countries like Indonesia, they all seem to be doing better than India. And we had all come to the conclusion that that is because India's economy was excessively controlled and excessively protected. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that if you make a comparison of how much control there was in India with other countries, there's no question that we were excessively controlled. There was no question that we weren't doing very well, although our performance had improved a little bit in the 80s. I mean, we did reasonably well. If you want a big narrative, we did reasonably well after independence compared to other developing countries, right up to the middle of the 1960s. Uh, India was still thought to be a developing country, which seems to be going down the right path. Middle of the 1960s through the 1970s, we became much more state control oriented and inward oriented. And by the end of the 1970s, it was very clear that this was not leading to good results. In the 1980s, there was a little bit of liberalization, first under Indira Gandhi when she came back in the post-emergency period, and then under Rajiv Gandhi in the second half of the 80s. But Rajiv Gandhi had actually said we need a system change. I mean, he said that in Parliament, but he wasn't able to bring that about. And that system change is what happened in 1991. Now, many people, we had a crisis in 1990. We had to go to the IMF and the World Bank. Many people who criticized the reforms said that these reforms are just being done because we are being pushed into it by the IMF and the World Bank. In my book, I have argued that that is not true. There was a considerable internal debate. I also had the privilege of participating in that debate, and there was a considerable internal view that we are excessively controlled and we need to decontrol. In 1991, we got that opportunity, and the government of Mr. Narasimha Rao, with Manmohan Singh as finance minister, took the opportunity to make a system change. And why do I call it a system change? You know, a system change is about what you say and what you do. And I think what he said, I mean, the other thing is that it was a Congress-led government, minority government, a Congress-led government. So they couldn't actually say that we're reversing everything. But the fact is that they did junk a lot of what used to be the central theme of earlier governments. And they were, number one, that the public sector must occupy the commanding heights of the economy. That's the phrase that was often used. And I think what this policy, in 1991, we said, look, the reserved area of the public sector should shrink to no more than 18 sectors, and within a few years, that was actually reduced to 8. So the old idea that if a sector is important, it must be dominated by the public sector was just junked. Second, the private sector must be tightly controlled because it tends to misuse resources. So not only were certain areas reserved for the public sector, in the areas not reserved for the public sector, there was kind of an implicit preference between the private sector in favor of the public sector. This was also junked. I mean, the idea was, look, markets with some degree of regulation will bring about competition and let the private sector free. Let them, if they have money and they want to invest, let them invest. So a dramatic reduction in the control of the government on the private sector. Third, open up the economy, both to trade and to capital flows. In the case of trade, we were at that time one of the most protected economies in the developing world. There's no dispute about that. I mean, that can be tested and shown in terms of average tariff rates and quantitative restrictions and what have you. And I think the view was that when an economy is open, that's the only way you can tell if it's really competitive, and that we should open up, and a belief that if we open up, Indian enterprise will be able to compete. So we junked a lot of import controls, shifted to market-based controls, introduced initially a dual exchange rate where one was fixed and the other was market determined, very quickly unified that into a single market determined exchange rate. We retained control on capital flows, but over the next 2 or 3 years, this was also liberalized. FDI was allowed much more freely, but again in a gradual manner. I mean, initially, 51% equity was automatically allowed in a large number of sectors. This was later on increased quite substantially. As far as non-FDI, which is just people investing in shares but not actually controlling the investment, in capital flows into the portfolio market, so-called, was liberalized from 1992-93 onwards, again in a sequence of steps. So over 2-3 years, as people gained experience that when you allow this liberalization, it doesn't lead to too many bad results, and indeed leads to some good results, the scope was widened. So these are the big, and one other thing was that earlier we used to have reserving certain sectors for the small scale sector. This was universally regarded by many economists, not all, but by many economists, as very bad. Because what it did was sectors where we could have had export competitiveness were reserved for the small scale sector. Now, if you want to make a name for yourself globally, you need to do that through large private sector companies which will carry a reputational benefit. Doing it through small companies is not good enough. And we were constantly told that the reason why China is doing so well is that people would go to China and say, listen, we want to order 600,000 t-shirts of this kind. And China was able to say, right, we'll produce them. We were not able to do that. I mean, every individual t-shirt garment producer was a small scale guy and couldn't actually produce more than 10,000 t-shirts or some such thing. And in the global markets, it's not as if people are individually going to shops and buying t-shirts. I mean, the vast majority of t-shirts are bought through department stores and later online buying. So essentially, people are looking for assured supply in large quantity and with assured quality. Now, assured quality in the case of a t-shirt means that if you have a color chart which says we've got 5 t-shirts, one is purple, one is pink, one is blue, one is gray, and they show the gray, every t-shirt gray must look like the sample gray. Whereas if you order it from 30 different guys, everybody's gray is a little bit different. And our people very often would say, that's part of the charm. Like if you go to Fab India, I'm not making an advertisement for Fab India, although I like the shop. Maybe many of you are familiar with it. Everything is a little different. I mean, if you want an orange kurta for men or women, there are several orange kurtas, but it's not identical. And if you ask the Fab India guys, they will tell you, but that's part of the charm. That's true, and those who look for handicrafts value that. But when you're buying stuff for a big department store, they don't value that, and therefore we lost out. And there was a very strong view that we should de-reserve these things and let bigger units produce them. But frankly, we weren't able to do it. Now we actually did it, but it took 15 years. I mean, from 1991, I think the last reservation of small scale was done by the Vajpayee government, or even later than the Vajpayee government, actually. So it took a very long time. There were a couple of areas which were also on the verge of consideration. One was, why not, now that you don't have a hang up in favor of the public sector, why not privatize? That the Congress party was not actually all that willing to do. And later on, it turned out the other parties also are not very comfortable with it. So frankly, the maximum we were able to do was to sell shares in public sector companies. So we call that things like disinvestment and all. And that's what we seem to be continuing to do. Although the big difference is that after the Narasimha Rao government, you had the United Front government. And the United Front government was the first government that said, they set up a committee which said, please make up your mind and in a non-strategic area, sell off the damn thing. Okay. They never did it because it didn't last long enough. Along comes Vajpayee government. Vajpayee government, I mean, one expected that the BJP would not be very pro-public sector. That was a very Congress party kind of preoccupation. And predictably, the Vajpayee government said, yeah, we can privatize in a lot of non-strategic areas. They tried to do that. And Arun Shuri, who's a good friend of mine, was bold enough to actually do some privatization, but ran into immense problems and controversies later on. And of course, when the United Progressive Alliance came in, Manmohan Singh's government, of which when I was deputy chairman, they, of course, having left parties and the Congress party, they were not even openly saying we'll do privatization, but they were doing disinvestment. So the privatization of a large part of the public sector is a logical part of the 91 reforms and was poorly done, no question. Another thing that was actually not done at all was the labor law reform. One of the constant criticisms of our control economy was that, we do not have a sufficiently flexible labor market. In the sense that if you hire someone permanently, it's impossible to fire them. And if you're going to be internationally competitive, you're going to have to work in an environment where the market changes all the time. And if you need to be able to respond to the market, then you lose a market. Sure, you're going to try and get it back. But in the meantime, in order not to go broke, you have to shed labor. So the theory used to be that if you have flexible labor markets, there'll be much faster overall growth, of employment, but much less stability and an individual firm employment. So the probability of your getting fired would be higher, but the probability of finding a job if fired would be much higher also. Now, we all knew this and we all said labor reform is necessary, but we never did. Certainly the Narasimha Rao government under Manmohan Singh didn't. The UPA government didn't. The Vajpayee government also didn't. The UPA, sorry, I said earlier UPA, I meant United Front. The UPA government under Manmohan Singh talked about labor reform, but didn't do anything. And on one occasion, Manmohan Singh was asked, look, what about labor reforms? You want us to grow rapidly. We have a labor surplus. We should be able to utilize the benefits, but with rigid labor laws, we can't. And what he said was that, look, labor issues are social. They're not just economic. And we must first get the economy to grow at 10%. And if people see that the economy is growing rapidly, they'll be more willing to accept reforms in labor laws. But of course, we did grow rapidly during the first 6-7 years of the UPA, and then growth slowed down. The present government has talked about labor law reforms. We'll come to that if you like. But it hasn't really it has introduced some more flexibility, which actually is welcome, but not as much as a true believer in flexible labor markets would say. And if there are questions on this, I can address it. So the overall, this is the overall picture of decontrol. Now, underlying this decontrol question is what you might call the problem of macroeconomic stability. I mean, governments must conduct their business in a way in which the fiscal deficit is not too high. Because what happens is, if the fiscal deficit is very high, what does it mean? It means that the government is borrowing in the market. Since the government is always regarded as the preferred borrower, because the government can print money. So if you lend 100 rupees to the government, one thing you can be sure about is that it will give you back 100 rupees, because if necessary, it will print the money. The problem is, if it prints the money in an uncontrolled manner, prices will go up. So the real value of what you get back will be less, but you will get back 100. But when you lend 100 to a corporate unit, the real value will also go down, but you may not get the money if the firm gets broke. So the problem is the corporate sector always has to pay a higher interest rate than the government for loans in rupees because of this element of risk. Now, if the government borrows much more than is available for saving, then it puts an upward pressure on the interest rate. And the corporates who need money will therefore have to borrow at even higher interest rates. And typically, it's the weaker, the smaller sectors that suffer. That's why it's important for the government not to have too high a fiscal deficit. Now, we can discuss this at length if you want, but I would say that in 1991, we were borrowing too much. We had a fiscal deficit that was almost 7+% of GDP, or some such thing, more than that actually. And we wanted to bring it down to 6. We brought it down. It then went up again. By the time the Vajpayee government was ending its stay, they passed the FRBM Act. The FRBM Act tried to put a sort of, if you like, a statutory limit on borrowing, in the belief that this would constrain the government to act responsibly on the fiscal front. It was implemented by the UPA government, although the bill was passed in the last year of the Vajpayee government. And in the first 4 years of the UPA, the fiscal deficit was reduced sharply. That was the period when growth was very high. and the fiscal deficit was reduced. But then we ran into the global financial crisis of 2008, when the government felt we had to pump in more money to help the economy. So they departed from this fiscal thing. They brought in a revised set of fiscal targets, didn't meet those. Then along comes the current government. They've also brought in a revised set of fiscal targets. And for one reason or another, we haven't met them. So actually, if you were to ask yourself the question, what is India's fiscal deficit record? Well, the short answer is that, first of all, the fiscal deficit should be taken to mean both the central government and the state government fiscal deficit, because the central government authorizes state governments to borrow. And ours has been somewhere 9 to 10% or something of that order, if you measure it correctly. And this more or less takes up all the financial savings available in the system. So constantly, the central government has been saying that we will bring the fiscal deficit down. At one point, we were supposed to bring it down to, 3.5% for the center, maybe 2.5% for the states. So total comes to somewhere around 6, maybe 6.5. We're nowhere near that. Now, there have been short-term hits in the economy, like the pandemic and so on. And therefore, every year, there's always some excuse. But most people, the bottom line is that India's total fiscal deficit is about 3 times what it is for other developing countries. I mean, that's the bottom line. Nobody actually denies this. I mean, every finance minister says he or she is going to bring the fiscal deficit down over time. But it's not really clear what they're doing to bring it down. Because there are 2 things you have to do. One is you've got to control your expenditures and limit the expenditures to what is really necessary. And the other is you've got to introduce tax reforms that will lead to a higher ratio of tax to GDP. Now, the fact of the matter is that we find all kinds of expenditures to be justifiable, one kind of subsidy or the other. And particularly at the time of elections, every government of every party announces all kinds of schemes, as if money is kind of, growing on trees. And there's no political discipline on this at all. When a party, I don't want to mention any party, but I think those of you who read the newspapers will know that in the course of the current election, both the party currently in power and the parties in opposition have made all kinds of promises about all kinds of schemes that they're going to introduce. None of them have said, this is how they're going to be financed, and we're going to get rid of A, B, or C, which we think is wasteful. Nor have they said, in order to raise money, we are going to do D, E, and F. They've just said we're going to announce these things. And frankly, this is not new. This has been going on for several years. I think for your generation, I honestly think you as voters have to ask yourself, how do you persuade people that statements of extra money being spent make no sense unless they're combined with statements about how the money is going to be raised? And there are really only 3 ways in which money is going to be raised. One, introduce some very basic tax reforms, which for the same GDP mobilize more revenue. 2, review your expenditures and get rid of expenditures that you don't think are very useful. And 4, do reforms that will raise the growth rate. Because, if you can raise the growth rate, more revenues will come. So basically, most politicians, if asked, will say, don't ask me about taxes and don't ask me about cutting out expenditure, but I'm promising you 10% growth. Now, if they actually deliver 10% growth, then it's true that the taxes will come. But for that, you need a very measured judgment that what are the policy changes that you are now bringing which will cause the growth rate to go up. And that debate, I don't think, is taking place in a sensible kind of way. And it's not an easy debate, by the way, because when you get into it, you will have very different views on what is the right thing to do. I mean, let me give you just one example. I think I've already overshot my time, so I'm going to stop with this example. You know, a lot of people, there are two sorts of economists. One who say that, look, if you want to have growth, you must be competitive, you must be efficient, and you must be able to exploit India's comparative advantage in the world. For that, you need to have an open economy and you need to lower your tariffs. There's another bunch of economists who say, no, you need to develop your industry. For that, you need to protect them. For that, in order to be Atmanirbhar, you need to raise customs duties. And at the moment, in the last 3 years, that's what we've been doing. Now, if you believe that raising customs duties and having a production link incentive will somehow mobilize lots of investment and will create enough pressure to be competitive, you would say that, look, this is the way to raise growth. On the other hand, if you believe that usually this will lead to industries demanding protection, which for themselves, which will raise the cost of those who use their products, and that will have downstream effects on the economy and make the economy less competitive, but this approach will actually lower growth. So, you know, the objective of Atmanirbhar, defined as a strong economy which is competitive and internationally competitive and produces stuff for itself and for the world, this is, as a slogan, this is impossible to disagree with. I agree with the slogan. Question you have to ask yourself is, what is the slogan supposed to achieve? And if somebody says it's supposed to achieve 20% growth of exports and 9% growth of GDP, I'd say fine. I mean, I agree with that too. So the question is, what are the policies that are going to lead to that? And then you come to these questions. We should raise protection or we should lower protection. My own view is you should lower protection, but there are a lot of fellows arguing for it. And the debate is not being conducted on these issues. The debate is being conducted on, are you in favor of Atmanirbhar or not? And this is the choice that you guys have is, how can you narrow the debates that are currently going on so that you can make a distinction, and I make a distinction, all policy, and I've said this in several lectures, so I'll repeat it now. You know, policies or strategies can be decomposed into the following 4 components. What are they? Number 1, slogans. Don't think of slogans as a negative description. Slogans are very important because they enthuse you. So getting the slogan right is good. I mean, for example, in the UPA, we had a slogan saying inclusive growth. Okay, it wasn't just growth, inclusive growth. That means growth which helps everybody. Then in the 12th plan, we realized that merely pushing for growth, even inclusive growth, can lead to a degradation of the environment. And therefore, some people would say that inclusive growth doesn't lead to a degradation of the environment. But, you know, I think you can easily show that even with inclusive growth, if it's energy intensive, dependent on coal, produces high pollution, it can lead to a degradation of the environment. So we coined the slogan, inclusive and sustainable growth. Subsequently, the current government, I mean, they had a different approach to growth. They didn't actually set a growth target, but they said $5 trillion economy by the year 2024. Now, somehow, I mean, it's a judgment that if you work that out, that turns out that you need to grow at about 10% or some such thing in order to achieve that. But if they had simply said, obviously, I mean, I'm not in a position to judge, but I think as a political slogan, they must have felt that we don't want to just say that the UPA said in the 12th plan, 8.5% growth and we are going to go to 10%. I mean, that would be a big improvement. But they said, why have a target? Maybe because they'd abolished planning, so somehow growth rates are associated with planning. So the target was $5 trillion economy by the year 2024. If you translate that into growth, it means about 10% growth. The advantage of using 10% growth is that every year you can judge whether you're on track. The advantage of 5 trillion economy is that you can say, well, let me know, I'll tell you in 2024. It's quite clear now that there is no chance of us being a 5 trillion economy. Of course, the pandemic, etc., have caused are an external factor that have come in. But that's an example of targeting or doubling farmers' income by 2022. That also implied a growth rate, and I think the government committee said the growth rate of income would have to be 11%. So those are targets, and I think the targets are good because the slogan is very difficult to quarrel with. A slogan is as good as the image it evokes. A target sets a measurable standard of achievement, which you can then find out later on whether it works. But the real debate is not really about targets, because most people which have good slogans end up with decent targets. Question is, how do you achieve those targets? And you achieve those targets in two ways. One is by policies. You change policy. And the other is by programs. You spend government money. And I think I would be happier if more of the debate were to fix on policies and programs. As far as programs are concerned, it's also very important to realize that we have been inventing programs for the last 30 years. I mean, today, if you go and look at the budget, there are approximately 170 schemes that are listed. And this has been true for the last 20 years. And some schemes are aimed at women, and some are farmers, and some are children, and some on education, and this, that, and the other. Every now and then a scheme gets renamed, or we decide to put more money into the scheme. So renaming a scheme, to my mind, is just a slogan. Putting more money into a scheme is a substantive decision. But you can easily put money into a scheme and not use it effectively. So if you're a great believer in the effectiveness of programs, you must simultaneously have independent ways of assessing whether those programs are achieving their targets or not. And let me say, no program achieves 100% of its targets. So the political debate can go on. I mean, if you happen to be in the opposition, you can be 100% sure that every program will fall short of 100%. And you will say, obviously, you haven't achieved what you intended to do. Okay? But a public is sensible. I mean, in my view, if you achieve 90%, people will say, well, that's 100%. If you achieve 80%, they'll say, well, it could have been better, but that's pretty good. But when you start 50, 60, that's poor performance. And you should get no credit for doing 50 or 60, because that would have happened in any case. So the debate needs to shift to policies that you need for the kind of growth you want and the programs you need. The big thing about programs is you have to be watchful that the total size of the program kitty is affordable. And that's what comes down to the fiscal deficit issue. Anyway, I think I've spoken enough. But in my view, if I were guiding you people, I hope that you will realize that we're still a poor country, and anything short of 8% growth for India in the medium term is bad. Whether we achieve it right now, I mean, you're in the worst time of the world to evaluate economic policy because there's a global crisis going on in Ukraine, and nobody quite knows how it's going to end. It is going to affect every economy, and every government will be able to say, oh, I'm sorry, but this year we had this very unexpected development. Oil prices have already shot up, etc., etc. But this is not a permanent. I don't think the Ukraine crisis is going to go on. I mean, maybe in about 2 months' time, it'll settle down. Okay. So then the question we have to ask is, what is the growth rate? In order to achieve that, what are the policies? And there are debates on that. And as far as programs are concerned, I mean, how are you designing the program so that it's better than in the past? And is the total money spending on all the programs consistent with fiscal deficit? The more the debate focuses on this, the more intelligent and productive our politics will be. Thank you. That's it for me. I'm waiting for questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Amna, you can go ahead with the questions. All right, I guess there are some connectivity issues in Delhi today. So I'll start with the first question that we have in the chat box. So first question is by Dipali. She has asked that one of the main reasons behind the 1991 reforms was that India's future as a potential superpower could be seen, and rightly, so our economy went from a poor, lackluster one to one of the world's fastest growing economies. But the past 30 years of liberalization have been more on the private sector success. On the other hand, the failures of the public sector and the institutional erosion have been overlooked by this fact. That maybe sums it up that India never really dwelled into that superpower vision it had 30 years back. So most notably, which is called an era of neoliberalism, is it more suitable to call it an era of neo-illiberalism?
Well, that's a very complicated question that raises a number of issues. By the way, I don't think any of us thought of India becoming a superpower. You know, you guys must realize that we may well be soon the fourth biggest economy in the world. But if we have the largest population in the world, measuring your power by your GDP is actually a little misleading. So I don't know what our rank in per capita GDP or something of the order of 120th or something like that. We certainly expected to go from the low income category into the middle income category, and we succeeded during the UPA regime in pushing ourselves into the bottom of the middle income category. We were not foolish enough to think that we will become a superpower. I mean, to become a superpower, you have to have two things. You have to have a much larger GDP than we do. And secondly, I think you probably need to be able to spend a lot more on defense, because superpowers can only demonstrate their power if they have a stronger defense capability. And I don't think we were aiming at that, nor I think, we use the term, we love it when somebody calls us a superpower, but the fact of the matter is that we are a rapidly growing economy. We're an economy which has a lot of promise, but we weren't aiming at being superpower. Now, on the question of the deterioration of public institutions, I think underneath that question, I think is a legitimate concern. That is, assuming that you don't mind the growth of private sector. I mean, this is another issue. Are you saying that an unconstrained growth of the private sector is inherently bad, and therefore we should have public sector? Or are you saying that crony capitalism and large private sector companies can manipulate the market, and that is bad, and government should introduce regulatory systems that will ensure fair competition? Now remember, when we say fair competition, if you're thinking about people not being able to exercise monopoly power, no matter how big an Indian corporation is, it cannot exercise monopoly power if your market is open to world competition. Because even our biggest corporations are small compared to the corporations that exist in the rest of the world. So, I mean, the way to regulate big guys is to subject them to global competition, not in the sense that you've got to compete in order to export, but you've got to compete in order to hold your market share. Now, I would grant that, a little bit of protection doesn't cost you too much. But, the honest truth is that if you're based in India, as far as the domestic market is concerned, you have a natural advantage because you know your market. So why do you want to shut yourself off from competition? Most people who worry a lot about big private sector companies becoming too dominant and exploiting the Indian consumer don't seem to recognize that the way to protect the Indian consumer is to allow more foreign competition. And I think it's only, the problem only arises if you say, no, I don't want foreign competition, but at the same time, I want to control this guy. I mean, that is a loser's game, if you ask me. Now, having said that, there are issues that you still have to take up. How do you have regulated competition? Every country handles this problem through a competition commission. And we were very aware of this. And we did have a competition commission, which was set up. All these institutions evolve over time. There is no such thing as a perfectly designed institution. Institutions are set up, new challenges arise. I mean, look, when the Competition Commission in India was set up sometime in the early 2000s, digital trade didn't exist. Today, competition between online retailers is a totally new phenomenon. And countries around the world are judging, is this competition fair? And how do we make it fair? My view on this is, let us not invent rules for ourselves. Let us see how other people are behaving, and let us be part of a global consensus on how you regulate digital competition. And that's, by the way, not the only thing. I mean, corporate governance is a very important thing, in the sense that if you're going to have private sector competition can only work if private sector companies at least observe the corporate laws in place. This requires first-rate auditors. This requires a board which supervises the auditors' work, and all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that a person who controls a company cannot engage in fiddles. Now, I mean, if you look at the story about scams going on in India, and these have been going on over the years, and they're continuing even today, you realize that, look, this is a big problem. And it's not a unique Indian problem. The biggest scam that came about was Enron, which happened in the United States. So I think, it would be a total disaster if you took the view that if I find a scam involving a private sector company, that means the private sector shouldn't be given freedom. That is a guaranteed way of going down to the low income category. But if you say merely because you have the private sector doesn't mean that you will get good competition, you're 100% right. Therefore, if you're going to have the private sector, you need to have very watchful competition regulators to make sure that the private sector fellows behave properly. You're 100% right. And you should look at what's going on in the rest of the world. I mean, for example, Facebook is very upset when the Indian government wants to put some restrictions. But the US government and the Europeans are also putting restrictions. So we have to watch what they're doing and learn from it. Now, we don't have to do exactly what they're doing, in the sense that there may be certain things that are unique to us. But, as long as we can tell Facebook that, look, you've got a potential over 1 billion customers in this country, but it's not a free-for-all for you. We are going to have rules, and our rules are going to reflect a global consensus on how digital trade should be regulated. It won't be 100% uniform, but it will be in line with the global consensus. And within that, if you think we're doing something wrong, let us know, and we're open to considering it. That's the kind of debate that we should have.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful words. Now, I would like to take the question of Radhika Narula and Akshat Jain. So Radhika basically asks a question. You mentioned that deficit of a country should be low, but sir, in economy, it is also said sometime that increasing physical deficit is a nation's strategy to stabilize economy. So sir, what is a better strategy for nation? And
It is a very simple answer to this. Uh, First of all, it's absolutely true that the fiscal deficit should play a contra-cyclical role. When you got an ideal fiscal deficit, now what should be an ideal is subject to discussion. Up to now, all these expert committees that we have set up have said that the Indian government fiscal deficit should be around 3.5% of GDP. Okay, it's actually about more than twice that. But let's forget that and say, look, we need a clear trajectory which takes the 6.5 down to 3.5. That trajectory has to be based on some assumption about how expenditures are going to grow and how revenues are going to grow. And that growth of revenues is going to be a function of the growth of GDP. The growth of GDP that you assume has to be consistent with the overall investment level in the economy and the policy reforms that you're introducing in order to achieve efficiency. Okay. Once you've done that and you get a trajectory, then it's absolutely true that if there is an external shock, remember an external shock, which depresses growth in the economy, it makes sense to have a larger fiscal deficit to provide demand to stimulate the economy. But by the same token, this suggests that when that is done, you should go to a larger surplus so that you can offset the deficit. So you're supposed to run a deficit in bad times and a surplus in good times so that the two balance off. Okay. What happens, of course, is that when the economy is depressed, government says, I must expand my expenditure. Then when the growth recovers, revenues increase, government says, oh, I've got the revenues now, I'm going to keep spending. That's what's wrong. You need a structural deficit concept. That is not just a deficit, but a structural deficit which reflects the state of the economy. And you can build a fiscal mathematics around it. I mean, we discussed this internally, but the Finance Commission, I had in my representations to the Finance Commission said that setting a target deficit doesn't make sense. You should set a structural deficit target. And a structural deficit means that if the economy is depressed and the deficit has to be raised because revenues are low, you could have a rise in the deficit, which is not a rise in the structural deficit. It's a structurally adjusted deficit. But I don't think that this was not accepted. Anyway, it's something that needs to be debated.
Thank you, sir. Sir, since we are getting so many queries, can we please extend the session a few more minutes if you permit?
Oh, of course. I'm talking too much. My fault. I apologize to all the young people.
It's all right, sir. Thank you. Sir, there's a query. When countries facing depression or contraction, for example, during pandemic, normally RBI and government adopts expansionary policies. But sir, as people have less purchasing power during depression and not ready to spend more, will this expansionary policies leads to expansion of economy?
No, that's a very, very good point because, the unwillingness to spend has to be factored in determining how much expenditure you should undertake yourself. Okay. But this also illustrates the answer I gave last time around. It's quite possible that, people are uncertain about what's going to happen in the next 6 months. So even though they have spending power, they hold it back. Now, if you want to support demand in that period, then you should actually spend more. However, it also means that when the uncertainty ends and you get pent-up demand coming into the economy, the government should spend less. So, if the government responds in a continuous way to the state of demand, you can get a sensible expansionary policy. But what you can't have is a situation where there's uncertainty, income is being generated, but it's not being spent. There are two problems. One is, look, there's a collapse in output. So some people just don't have income. So their demand is gone. But not everybody's income has collapsed, but there's uncertainty. So those whose income is there are deciding to save. So you need to put into the economy enough expenditure to offset the lost expenditure of those who lost income, as well as the suppressed expenditure or degree of suppression of expenditure of those who didn't lose income but who suffered from uncertainty. Fine. You put this in, that will help the economy go up. When the uncertainty goes down, then the suppressed demand comes back. At that point, you should reduce government expenditure, saying, look, I don't need this expenditure. So you need a component of government expenditure that can be varied. That's the crux of it.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to take the question of Vivek and Anjali. They have asked a question related to New Economic Reform 1991. It said that pre-LPG Indian economy was agri-dominated, while the post-LPG economy service sector dominated. The manufacturing sector, the sector which actually produces employment, never got its due attention. So in a world where economies are slowing down and countries are going back to protectionism, what's the future of India's manufacturing sector, and how the economy policy of 1991 affecting the current situation of COVID-19?
Well, that's a large number of questions wrapped up into one. So first point is on COVID-19. I don't think it's fair to ask what is 1991 doing to COVID-19. 1991 started a process, then COVID-19 hit. COVID-19 created a short-term problem. It's legitimate to ask what should the government have done. That's a separate question, okay? As far as agriculture versus manufacturing is concerned, I do not think at all that the manufacturing sector was not benefited by the 1991 reforms. On the contrary, the manufacturing sector became modernized and became more competitive. Manufacturing exports also increased, none of which would have happened without the 1991 reforms. I mean, I don't think any of you even have seen an ambassador car, maybe one or two have still, or a Fiat car. Before 1991, those were the only cars around. Since then, the automobile industry has got totally transformed. The consumer electrical industry has got totally transformed. Now, it is true that many of the air conditioners that are produced in India, some of them are produced under foreign labels. They're produced in India. Some of them do import some components, but getting to 100% domestic production is not necessary. Actually, anyone who thinks that the domestic manufacturing industry has not benefited as a consumer should think about the fact that today, if you're thinking of yourself as a consumer, the quality of manufactured products available to you today is vastly superior to what was available in 1991. And as a matter of fact, you can get products pretty much at global quality standards, although you pay a little bit higher for them. So don't have any doubt in your mind that the reforms did not help manufacturing. What is true, however, is that the reforms did not lead to a transformation of manufacturing in the way in which, to be fair, even I thought we would achieve. I mean, I thought we would achieve double-digit growth of manufacturing, quite frankly. We didn't. We achieved higher growth, 9%, 8%, but not double-digit, okay? So the question is, why did that not happen? I think the short answer is that that sort of transformation would have required an export-oriented manufacturing strategy. And it is true that while our manufacturing strategy vastly improved the quality of the products we produce, also allowed for a high growth rate. I mean, remember, 8 to 9% is a high growth rate. At the moment, it's down to 4. So it produced a high growth, but not double digit. And I think the short answer is, why did we not become globally competitive? the way the Chinese did. I think there are many, many reasons for that. And one of the most important is that, we didn't address three critical things. Four actually. First, in order to be globally competitive, you need world-class infrastructure. We improved our infrastructure, but we didn't make it world-class in the sense that today, thanks to the reforms, somebody flying out or inside India flies out of a very modern airport. So as far as the consumer is concerned, the quality is quite good. But if you're exporting a product and you're producing it in Jalandhar, getting it to an airport which can fly out the stuff out is a horrendous process which takes far too long. So there are logistical problems and there are also process problems. The number of permissions needed, this, that, and the other. Internationally, if you're manufacturing for a global market, it's not generally known, but a very high percentage of, say, clothes in the United States are bought around Christmas because that's when people buy stuff and then they buy it on discount and so on and so on. So you have to get your product there 1 week before the sale process begins. Now, if you have a system where a delay of 2 weeks is regarded as normal, I mean, nobody in his right mind is interested in tapping that supply chain because you can't absolutely guarantee that what you're producing is going to get to me in time for my shopping season, whether it's the spring sales or the autumn sales or the summer sales or whatever, Christmas sales. You're not going to get much more orders. And we didn't address that issue. That's partly a state government matter, it's partly a central government matter. I give you a very simple example. I mean, export of mangoes, we found that, you have to get the mangoes in. Then if there's a 24-hour delay between the mangoes coming into the customs station and being put on the plane, that's unacceptable because it should have been within 2 hours. And secondly, in order to load the mangoes, if the thing is pulled to the plane and then left to wait in the sun for 5 hours before it's loaded, that's disastrous. We just didn't have in place those kinds of improvements. And in my view, by the way, a lot of that is because we didn't have the private sector handling it. I mean, it's virtually impossible in public sector dominated airports to get that kind of quality. Well, we finally did get privatized airports, Bombay, Delhi, but not all the airports are private yet. So I think those are some of the reasons. And those who worry about manufacturing, and they're right to worry about manufacturing, don't get equally excited about the need to do these reforms. So infrastructure is one, procedures is another, and I think the third one, quite honestly, is that our labor laws were not consistent with anyone wanting to hire 15,000 workers running an export unit. Because if you're running an export unit with 15,000 workers and there's a possibility of a downturn, you need to get rid of 5,000 workers. And the labor laws don't allow that. In fact, even the recent liberalization of labor laws, which all they've done is they've raised the limit at which the labor laws become effective has been raised from 100 employees to 300 employees. Okay. It was 300 employees in 1980. Under Mrs. Gandhi at that time, to offset some of the liberalization done, she was persuaded that this would be a pro-labor move to lower 300 to 100. All that we've done is gone back to 1980. And in 1980, we had little experience of exports. To give flexibility up to 300 workers is simply not enough. Because if you want to be internationally competitive, you need to think of companies that can hire 15,000 workers and shed 5,000 if necessary. And we've not even addressed that question so far.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering so patiently. Now, I would like to take the question of Neeraj. Despite many measures taken by government like single window program, Make in India, etc., industrial sector still had a room to improve its performance in the economy. According to you, what reforms are needed to increase performance of industries?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. You know, your question reflects the desire to go beyond slogans. Make in India is a slogan. It's an excellent slogan. I mean, there have been similar slogans earlier. The question you're asking is, what are the policies in order to do Make in India? Well, I think I've given the answer to that. The policies are much more improvement in infrastructure. I think the present government has declared that intention. We have to see how it gets translated into practice. You know, when you translate something into practice, you realize how difficult it is. For example, the high-speed freight connection between Mumbai and Delhi was originally inaugurated by the UPA government under Dr. Manmohan Singh. And at that time, the target date for completion was 2018. The current government endorsed that correctly and is pursuing it, but it's nowhere near being completed. And the problem is not with the central government. In order to complete this, you have to have land acquisition. Land acquisition in it becomes a state government matter, and if somebody wants to object to it, I mean, they take the matter to court. So I mean, this is the other side of being a democracy, that, you know, we cannot ride roughshod over objections. In China, this question wouldn't arise. I mean, if the Politburo in China were to decide that we are going to build a train from A to B, all the land necessary can be instantly handed over. Because actually, there's no private ownership of land in China. I mean, all the land in China is owned by the government. You only have the right to cultivate. But that right to cultivate cannot be justiciable. So the government could just say, well, look, we've taken away this land, and let's separately discuss what we owe you as compensation. That can't be done in India, because the fellow can take you to court. So, I mean, you need to translate. I mean, we have the slogan, PM Gati Shakti is a slogan, but you need to translate it into a target. What does PM Gati Shakti mean for the following projects, and what is the end line? And then we can give responsibility to someone to complete those projects within the given end line. So that's one set of things. I think I disagree with the current view that the way to develop Make in India is by protection. I think that's a mistake. I think it's counterproductive. The best thing I can do to you is to recommend you to read Naushad Forbes' book. It's called The Struggle and the Promise, recently published. Here, I'll show it to you. And you know, he's one of our leading industrialists, the chairman of Forbes Marshall, Pune-based manufacturing company. You know, Naushad Forbes' story is very interesting, because he has said that when the 91 reforms happened, he and his brother, who run the company, said to themselves, how do we respond to the new world? And they looked at their own company and they said, look, we have very high costs of production. What are the different things we produce? And which are the things which we could produce at global prices, providing the inputs were also available at global prices? And they found that only 50% of what they were producing would meet that test. So they said, all the products that we are producing which don't meet that test, we junk. We get out of them and concentrate on the products which meets the test. That if you get your inputs at world prices, your outputs will be at world prices. The company has done extremely well. They had almost no exports originally. They're now aiming at 50% exports. So the question is, Indian manufacturing can do these things if it is given an open environment in which to compete. And this is a very critical issue in which there is no agreement at the moment. I mean, but it's not just me saying it. If you want an economist who is a strong supporter of the BJP, I would just quote to you Arvind Panagria. He was the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog, which was set up as a replacement of the Planning Commission. And he strongly believed what we are saying. He said we should continue this process. These fellows have reduced tariffs. They haven't done enough, he said, and we should do more. But for whatever reason, his advice has not been taken. But it's not as if there are not people on the government side who don't say the same thing. So this is an issue of debate. It needs to be debated, and whichever side wins, well, we'll see what the end results. But I think that's a very major area. The third major area, I think, which is important, I think, is that we need a financial system in which the smaller industries can actually get access to credit on better terms than they're getting at the moment. And I think that's a complex issue. It relates to the issue of the banking sector. We have a banking sector which is still 65% public sector, 35% private. Private is expanding rapidly. The public sector is remaining a bit constrained. The government says that it is going to privatize banks. Well, let's see if they do. But certainly, I think reform of the financial sector is very important if you want to support manufacturing.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful explanation. Now, I would like to take the last question. Due to paucity of time, we couldn't be able to take all the questions. And the next question is, the number of Indian billionaires grew from 100 to 142, while 84% of households in the country suffered a decline in their income in 2021. In this context, we should adopt income distribution structure program like China, common prosperity for all, socialization of loss and individualization of profit is main coherent fault in modern capitalism.
No, I didn't understand that. What is it that you think we should adopt?
Yes, sir. The question is asked in this reference. What the step we have to take? We should to stop, adopt it or drop it.
No, adopt what?
So the question is in the context like we should adopt income distribution structure program like China Common Prosperity for All.
No, that's a slogan, no? I mean, we also have sabka saath, sabka vikas. So what exactly is it that we're talking about? I mean, that's a slogan.
Yes, sir. So I guess mainly the question is about that. Recently, most of the economists are talking that the problem is from the demand side in the Indian economy currently, and we need to give more income to the people. And we need
that's a valid in the middle of a pandemic. That's a totally valid point. That is, if you had a pandemic, okay, and you imposed a lockdown and so on, and lots of supply chain disruption, informal sector badly hit, people went away, etc. They don't have any income. So you need to supplement their income. That's correct. But that is a short-term response. I mean, that is, let's say, if you believe that the economy is going to get back to normal, let's say in the coming year, 22, 23, then if it's back to where it was in 2019-20, then all these income losses actually will disappear. Probably they won't in the informal sector. It might take a little longer. But this is not a long-term problem. I mean, unless you were Indian economy has a demand problem even before the pandemic, so don't confuse the pandemic problem with a more structural problem. Now, if people felt that even before the pandemic there was not enough demand, I would say the short answer, the reason for that is that before the pandemic, growth rate had gone down. I mean, look at data. Although there was a decline in output in 1920-21, the growth in 1990-20 was only about 3.7%. So remember, I mean, when I'm more familiar with the years when I was in government, but I think this is roughly correct. During the UPA, the GDP growth was 7.6% average. That is, after allowing for the slowdown which occurred in the last 3 years, for which the UPA was rightly criticized, and everybody said, "You fellows, what are you talking about growth? You slowed down." You know, the slowing down was to 5.7 in the last year. When the new government came in, they were able, the growth rate was going up anyway. Well, they saw it go up further, and it went up for 2 years. Subsequently, after both the demonetization and the GST, the growth rate has been decelerating. So the question really is that, in my view, a lot of the unhappiness about demand comes from the fact that the growth rate has gone well below 7.6% after 2016. Now, why it went below that is a separate issue which we can discuss. I mean, some people would say demonetization, GST, others may say no, there are other factors. Anyway, that's an open question. But it is not in doubt that it went down. So I think if the growth rate goes down, it's not fair to call it a distributional problem. That's a growth collapse. So I think we should not make the mistake of thinking that if the name of the game is to bring the economy back to high growth, that we should start focusing on distributional policies. I think that would be a fundamental error. And again, by the way, this is a position on which opinions differ. My friends on the left would probably say that no, this is a good opportunity to focus on distributional policies because that's what we always believed is important. And let's get away from growth based on private sector expansion. I personally think that would be a mistake.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering so patiently. और इसी के साथ हमारा यह प्रश्न उत्तर राउंड यहीं समाप्त होता है. And now I would like to request Mehak to come and give the official vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Krishika. I would like to begin this vote of thanks by thanking Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia sir for coming here, for guiding all of us and for enlightening us with such beautiful thoughts. Does someone want to say anything? Okay, no. So yeah, for guiding all of us and for answering all of our queries so patiently and in such a detailed manner. Then I would like to thank our convener, Mr. Vikram Singh Chaudhary, who couldn't be here due to some prior engagements, for helping us and for giving us the permission to hold this event. Then last but not the least, I would like to thank the entire team of Kartavya and the entire audience for coming here, and to the team for organizing everything so beautifully and so diligently that we could make this event a success, and for giving a kickstart to the Junoon in such a beautiful manner. So I think that is all from my side. Krishika, do you have any concluding lines, or is that over?
Yeah,
Yes.
I have. Just a minute. Amna can continue.
थैंक यू महक. और मैं इस सेशन की समाप्ति कुछ चंद लाइनों से करना चाहूंगी. क्यों डरें कि जिंदगी में क्या होगा, हर वक्त क्यों सोचें कि बुरा होगा, बढ़ते रहें बस मंजिलों की ओर, हमें कुछ मिले या ना मिले, तजुर्बा तो नया होगा. Thank you everyone. With this, our session comes to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening to me so patiently. And may I make a request? You know, I know you've been